Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast. I'm John Pemberton, a diabetes educator and researcher living with type 1 diabetes since 2008. I started the Glucose Never Lies website when my son tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies. In that moment, I realized I needed to build a resource strong enough to guide anyone who might care for him. At first, that meant writing clear, actionable management guides, but listening to Peter Attia's The Drive taught me something. Peter's conversations provide depth across nutrition, exercise, pharmacology, sleep, and much more. But I always find myself wondering, how does this information apply to people with type 1 diabetes? And this podcast is my attempt to fill that gap, where I have access to the world's leading researchers and thought leaders in type 1 diabetes. That gives me a unique opportunity to combine lived experience, professional expertise, and cutting-edge science, and to share it all on here in conversation. But an important note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. These conversations share knowledge and experiences. They do not create a therapeutic relationship. So, let's get started. Welcome to Glucose Never Lies podcast. Today, we've got Kirsten de Klerk from South Africa, a fine lady who has over, the last few years really made a difference in terms of continuous glucose monitoring in a South African context. And I was really excited to have this conversation, mainly because I saw Kirsten online kind of talking about CGM and talking about access to CGM and then the safety and the accuracy perspective, which I'm obviously very interested in. But then it kind of developed a little bit more than that, because actually there's almost a bigger story behind Kirsten's journey. And I thought it'd be such an amazing opportunity for people with type 1 diabetes to see someone with type 1 diabetes kind of undertaking a journey, which might not necessarily be obvious at the beginning, but as it develops, I think it's something that be very interesting. So welcome to the podcast.
Wonderful. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So obviously I've sort of given a little bit of introduction there, but I've alluded to the fact that you have type 1 diabetes and that you've been on some kind of journey. And I think it's always important at the beginning to kind of find out a little bit about yourself, your diagnosis, your sort of journey to this point. So I wonder if you can sort of let us know, like, how old were you when you got diagnosed? What was the situation? What were you testing with? What was your insulin? And then a little bit about your journey and whether it was a smooth ride or a bit of a rocky one.
Perfect. So yes, as you said, I was diagnosed at the age of 16. Type 1 diabetes is in my family. My uncle actually passed away from type 1 diabetes at the age of 27 on my dad's side. I also have a cousin living with type 1 diabetes. So it was definitely something that the family knew to look out for within our family history. And yeah, basically got diagnosed at 16 and it felt okay in the beginning. You know, they kind of label it as the honeymoon phase. And I vividly remember the night I went to the doctor and him telling me that I'd have to finger prick, take insulin multiple times a day, change my exercise regime, eat a different diet, and all these wonderful things. And as a 16-year-old, I ignorantly asked, okay, how long do I have to do this for? Because with any other sickness or illness I'd had before, you kind of take your antibiotic or your treatment and you get better. And I'll never forget him looking back at me and telling me that I'm going to have to do this every single day for the rest of my life. And I think that's when it really kicked in that this was what a chronic illness meant and what it meant to live with a long-term condition for the rest of your life. And I had a really great support system. My mom really kicked into gear as mothers can. And she did all of the research, she did all the carb counting. I went to school every day with a little packed lunchbox with all the exact carbohydrate amounts I could have, with a little letter telling me how much I needed to inject, what the glucose levels meant. So the school really took it on well as well. I had a hypo kit in the school office, so there was always emergency supply there. If I had a sugar low at school, my mom would come fetch me and I'd go nap it off for the rest of the afternoon. So it was really taken well in the school setting. And then I remember going to college after school, and I think this is something, even in a global context, that isn't spoken about a lot. And it's that transition from being a child with diabetes and having a caretaker be the main provider or carer of your diabetes management. And then actually that transition of this is your life, this is your condition, and there's no handover. There's no sitting down and being like, okay, this is going to be your baby now. You need to look after this, because all of a sudden you're a young adult and you've got all this freedom and you're so excited about this new life. And, I went into the college environment. I had new friends. I was partying a lot. Thankfully, I've always avoided alcohol, so that helped a lot. But I was sleeping odd hours. I was not exercising. I was eating a very random diet. And slowly but surely, I started to prick my finger and see these glucose levels that I knew were a problem and levels that I'd never seen before. But instead of speaking up about it, because I knew that maybe family members or healthcare professionals might judge me, I kept quiet about it. And I decided just to keep it to myself. And the more I saw these levels, the more I would avoid doctor's visits, the more I'd lie to my parents about what was actually going on with my diabetes management. The sicker and sicker I got, I was vomiting up to 3 times a week from high glucose events. And eventually I got to the point where I was so disappointed in myself that I decided that if I don't prick my finger, I will not see the glucose levels. So I won't be disappointed in myself. And so that was the start of what I now know is called diabetes burnout or distress. And I wish someone had told me or warned me about this at diagnosis phase, that this could come up in my lifetime with diabetes. And basically, it ended up being this journey of really self-blame, feeling like I didn't know what was going on with my body, really not understanding, and also trying so hard. I'd jump on the bandwagon on a Monday, do all of the right things, and by Wednesday, I'd fall off that bandwagon because it was all just too much. And yeah, basically for 2 years.
No, I was just going to say at that point, it's so interesting to hear you say that, because I as a day job, whatever that is, I support children and people and their families with diabetes. And it's so clear, especially with young people who are diagnosed at 15, 16, 17, around there. They're just about to get this independence and they've had a taste of it, and then they're brought back under the wing of the parents, which in some ways is nice, but other ways can be smothering. And then, as you say, it's like, wow, all of a sudden, you're going to then go to college, or you're 18 and you're let full responsibility of the most important, well, one of the most important things, certainly your health, and the potential dangers with it, really without the necessary tools in place. And the way I always sort of frame it to some of the parents we speak to is like, you're about to let your young person go somewhere. And it's a bit like saying, okay, you are being paid for in your house and everything, and now you have to pay a full mortgage. You're going to have to do a job every day. You're going to have responsibilities. You've got all this stuff to do, and you're going to go from 16 years and 364 days to 17 years. And just in that one day, you're going to be able to do it. And to me, it feels like that with diabetes is kind of like anyone would crumble under that pressure from a house perspective. And it's not too dissimilar from a diabetes perspective. I just had to say that because it was in my head anyway. I need to get it out.
Yeah, love that analogy. And it's so true. And I think, as I said, from a global point of view, I've spoken to many people and they feel the same way, that there needs to be that sort of transitional care in between your parents looking after you and you taking full responsibility and ownership of your diabetes management in those foundational years. Yeah.
And so then take us, so that you're there, you've sort of hit this wall, diabetes burnout. It's all sort of caving in. You have found a way of coping, which in fairness is a good way of coping. It might not be the best for long-term health, but for your short-term mental health, it certainly is basically take enough insulin to stop you going into diabetic ketoacidosis, but at the same time, don't take enough so you're going to go low, and just kind of ride that in between. Don't check, because once you check, you've got to do something about it, and just kind of live your life, which, I think it's not necessarily uncommon for people when they're in that stage. Obviously, you sat here and had this conversation, so things have turned around. What kind of happened to you or happened within your environment that kind of led you to going from that place to a different place?
So I think there was, and then I think this happens to all of us at some point in our lives, where you want something, but you don't know how to get there. And eventually you just get fed up with yourself. You just get over all the excuses you make for yourself, whether it's exercise or eating healthier or anything, whether you live with diabetes or not, that's something that you just can't do. And I was so frustrated with myself, and really just putting it at the back of my mind. And every year it was like, is this going to be a priority or not? No, I've got better things to prioritize this year. And I'll just always put it at the back. Just diabetes was, if I was driving in a car, diabetes was in the boot at the back of the car. It was there, but it wasn't a priority at all. And I vividly remember going from the college environment to the workplace and I started as an intern in the financial services industry in South Africa. And I vividly remember sitting at my desk one day and I felt this numbness in my toes. And I thought, this is what they warn you about. This is the start of what they describe as the long-term complications of type 1 diabetes, especially with high blood glucose levels, which I'd had for over 2 years. And I don't know what it was in me, because never once in those 2 years did I think, oh, it would be nice to chat to someone who actually has diabetes and actually connect with someone who understands what I'm going through. But something kicked my ass into gear, and I reached out to one of the biggest online diabetes community in South Africa and asked if there was some event or something that I could volunteer in. I decided to go overboard and just throw myself completely into the community aspect. So I ended up volunteering for a Diabetes Day event that November. It was on Sea Point Promenade, where if you've ever been to Cape Town, it's one of the busiest strips here in the Atlantic seaboard side. We tested people's glucose levels. I met people living with diabetes. I started an Instagram account, and at the time there was this really beautiful initiative going on called #LetterToMyDiabetes. And basically, and I would recommend this to anyone with any problem that you have in your life, whether it's love or diabetes or family problems, whatever it is. But basically what you do is you sit down somewhere lovely with a view. I specifically sat on this beautiful beach in Cape Town that has this beautiful view of Lion's Head. And I wrote a letter to diabetes, and I said everything I would want to say to it if I could speak to it. And it really was the turning point in my relationship with diabetes, because at that point I realized that diabetes isn't going anywhere. And the longer that I don't accept this as being part of my life, and the longer that I don't take accountability for this and turn my life around, the longer I'm going to be at war with my body, the longer I'm going to be misunderstanding myself. And I decided to start an Instagram account and basically just documented what it was like every day to live with diabetes, mostly to hold myself accountable. But it ended up connecting me with people all over the world that had access to many different things. And slowly but surely, one by one, a few South Africans here and there, and I started a little WhatsApp group, and we would do random meetups in the park and talk. And it was really the first in-person community that we had in South Africa, to get to meet and talk with like-minded people and who really understood what was going on.
That's really interesting, because I'm sure you got told so many times along your journey, and I've had these conversations with young people and myself, obviously, about, oh, this could happen when you're older and everything like that. But you need almost as like an event or a spark that really means something to you to kind of, I guess, just foster just enough motivation to do something. And your something was to reach out to the wider community. And it's often, I think you see this all the time. It's not really the healthcare professionals necessarily. It's getting a connection with someone who genuinely knows how crap it is at times, and just to be able to go, do you know what? I don't need any solution. I just want to rant and say, this is really pissed me off. And this is really annoying. And I know you understand, because you got the same thing too. And then, but then the ability to turn that round from, okay, now we've got off our chest. Let's do something about it together. Like, let's work together and find out a little bit about, what can possibly work is, I think, a really powerful thing. So I'm sure there's lots of people listening who may be in the same space that you were in at that point, who are kind of going, can't do it, it's too much, burying my head in the sand, taking the ostrich approach, absolutely not. And then, it just takes one little spark, one little nugget of motivation to reach out to someone that can just flick overnight into something which can, basically change your life, which it sounds like for you. You've started this small group and now it's getting bigger. You're finding out about more stuff. You're feeling more, kind of in tune with other people, and that you're in it together. And then where did it go from there? So you're now emerging out of the dark hole together, which is amazing. Where are you?
Yeah.
What's next?
So basically, as I said, I started really documenting and self-educating. So I think a lot of the time, when I was younger, it was kind of, you go to your doctor, you learn whatever you learn from your doctor, whether that's corrections in doses or carb to insulin ratios. But I really started to dive deep into the self-education components. And that's, John, looking at your blog, it really resonated with me, because I think all of us have dived into this rabbit hole of, what does it mean outside of the insulin and the numbers and the everything that goes on in diabetes management, your diet and your exercise? What else is going on here? Like, how do I show up and be a better person, not only for myself, but for those around me. And what does that look like? What are the levels that I need to be at to show up as my best self? And I really started questioning everything from, I've been taking the same insulin doses for 10 years. Have I spoken to my endocrinologist about what's new on the market? Or, as I started having these conversations from a global perspective, I realized that there were advancements in technology, there were advancements in medication. And I really went into this rabbit hole of two of my favorite books were Think Like a Pancreas and Bright Sparks and Landmarks. And I dove into all that education, and I started educating others on the education that I was picking up on. And that's why I really also loved your blog post, because that's exactly what I started doing. And the more I started speaking about this, the more I started getting invited to diabetes events or opportunities to speak as the lived experience component. And I think it was something that was severely lacking in the South African context, that lived experience component. It was a little bit delayed to what was happening in the global diabetes space. And through all of this, I got invited to the launch of flash glucose monitoring in South Africa. And this beautiful device was put onto my arm. And after having such a severe, or could I say traumatic experience with finger pricking, and having such emotional baggage with finger pricking, I went on to this wonderful technology for 2 weeks. And I just knew that after that 2-week period, there was no way I could go back. There was no way that I could live with diabetes and not have access to something like this. At the time, I was still working in financial management, and I couldn't afford it. CGM technology was not accessible. It was not funded by public or private healthcare sector. So in South Africa, we've got both components. And I decided to start babysitting on top of my full-time job so that I could pay towards my CGM after that. But the more I started speaking about it online, showing people how wonderful this device was, I realized no one in South Africa could afford it. And that's when I started asking myself, why should I get to live a better life with diabetes just because of where I was born and the privilege that I've had in having access to these things? Why do I get to have a better chance at having a better time in range, a better HbA1c? Why do I get a better chance at lowering my risks of long-term complications with diabetes just because of how or what family I was born into, or the background that I've lived and grown up in? And those kind of questions really just started grappling at my heartstrings. And it was something that would keep me up at night. And eventually I knew I just had to do something about it.
Yeah, there's a few things I want to unpack there, because you see me nodding. I was like, oh, that really resonates with me. But I mean, I think like Pancreas is my first book that I read. I was like, wow, okay, there's loads of things you can do with this. And then the second one for me was Sugar Surfing by Stephen Ponder. And I've had the privilege of meeting both of those two guys and had like lots of chats with them. But they were getting access to a continuous glucose monitor myself, and then really then going, okay, let's learn how this glucose behaves and why it does, and just keep asking that question on a personal level, which kind of leads to all sorts of nerdy experiments and bits and pieces. But for me, that's the fun. I mean, probably not fun for many people, but for me, I used to love that part of it. So I definitely resonate with that. And I think automated insulin delivery systems are amazing, but I don't use one. I just use a standard pump with CGM because I can outperform them, because I'm so nerdy, which is fine. I don't expect anyone else to do that. But the change from finger pricks to continuous glucose monitoring to see cause and effect in a rapid turnaround that you can then start attributing why things have happened and then really understand it, for me was just an absolute game changer from that perspective. And I think then from what you're describing also really resonates with me, because I remember we'd gone to ISPAD and I presented some work on the CGM dynamic glucose management that we used to teach at the Children's Hospital. And I always remember this Dr. Adler from Stanford. She came, so I really like your stuff you're talking about. How do you go about getting equal access to the people who you support? And where I work in Birmingham, it's very, very deprived area, the most deprived area in the UK. Only half of the population are for white ethnic backgrounds, and the other from ethnic minorities, and they're also the most deprived. So I was like, oh, yeah, no, we definitely give the technology out equally. Definitely. She's like, just go back and check. Go back and check the first 100 people that you put on one of these devices. Did you give half to the people who are white, half to the people from ethnic minorities, and also half to the most deprived? And I went back and I was just like, oh my God, We're like, the people who are on it, 85% white, and then 85% for the most affluent. I was like, oh, God. And that was unconscious bias kind of coming in. But what it really said to me was a little bit like you're describing. And the best way I can sort of explain to me is that they play something in one of the American institutions they call Step to the Line, where everyone starts at the back of like a 100-meter race, and they say, step to the line, which is basically one step forward if you had two parents. Step to the line if you had school dinners. Step to the line if you've always had a pair of shoes, boom, 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 boom. And then you look and you can see all the prison guards and all the people who've come for a day out in the prison are close to the finish line, and most of the inmates are right back on that line. It's like, okay, we're now going to start the race to the finish line, which is success in life. What's your chances? And it just kind of really made me think, wow, you've almost got to provide an equitable care is making sure that you give people what they need. So if people have had the privilege of being able to be educated, have money, etc., they need very little from a CGM perspective or a education perspective. But then people who really need a lot more, you kind of need people to advocate for them. And I think essentially that's what you're saying, isn't it? Is kind of you recognize that there is this amazing tool. For happenstance and luck, I am that person who stepped to the line. I'm so far forward, but actually I recognize that these people are so far back here. How can I help these people? They're never going to catch up to where I am because we can't go back to the beginning of life, but we can maybe close that gap. And what can we do to close that gap? And that's it. Am I picking that up about right?
100%. And you're speaking about that video that if anyone hasn't watched it, who's watching this podcast, highly recommend. Maybe you can link it in the notes or something. But I also watched that video, had the exact same impact on me. And I think it's that exact feeling of leaving people behind, kind of standing above, knowing that you get a better chance, but actually no one decided to get type 1 diabetes. No one decided to get diabetes. No one woke up and did this to themselves. So in that case, it's only fair that we all have an equal chance at living a better life with diabetes.
So where does that leave you now then? So I'm just going to plot your journey as I understand it. You tell me I got it right. So obviously diagnosed at 16, things are all good under mum's kind care. Get to 18, do what every young person at 18 does, is go out and has a great time, and diabetes gets put to the back burner. You have this kind of realization that actually, wow, this could actually impact me seriously. And then you build into a community which helps you kind of level up. You then find access to this continuous glucose monitor where things really light bulb for you, where you kind of like, wow, okay, I can really start to understand this thing now and get some proper feedback and be able to change. And then you hit the point where you're like, oh, wow, I can afford this because of luck in life. The genetic lottery, the parent lottery, whatever you want to call it. But there are other people in South Africa where, yes, you can get access to this thing on the private scheme and you've got to pay for it, but everyone else in the public is on what do they have access to right now in South Africa? If you're not on private insurance and you can afford this, what's people who are on public healthcare, what are they enabled with glucose monitoring?
Exactly. So basically I got to that point, as I said, of self-education. And while I was diving down those rabbit holes, I was gaining momentum and kind of building this community of people who wanted to create change. And via my nonprofits, I started a diabetes advocacy course to help other people that were living with diabetes that wanted to create impact within their own communities, whether that's in their church environment, school environment, around their own dinner table with their family, on how to advocate to create that change that they were looking for. Because so many people with diabetes have gone through something and they've had to overcome it. And a lot of the time they've had to do it alone. And now they want to show and they want to replicate that to other people. So I started this course, and the beautiful thing that this course brought me, it's a 4-week, I still do it. It's a 4-week free online course, a completely volunteer basis. And we kind of started building this base of people living with diabetes who wanted to become advocates. And through this course, I got into the perspective of how diverse the South African population is. And as you said, I started to learn about what's available in public healthcare versus private healthcare. And just to give you some numbers, I think more than 85% of people in South Africa actually access their health in the public healthcare system. And currently, as far as I'm aware, living with type 1 diabetes specifically only have access to 3 blood glucose testing strips a day. And that is only if they're lucky, if there's stock when they go and visit the clinic. So a lot of people are not testing at all. And then in the private healthcare sector, you have access to 5 testing strips a day. And when I started doing this research and diving into what these different stories look like, um, I also realized that I didn't need to reinvent the wheel, that in a global perspective, people have faced CGM access challenges before. And I knew that I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's when I started reaching out to the likes of Partha Carr and the NHS, started reaching out to friends that I'd met in the global context. I was also part of the IDF Young Leaders in Diabetes program. So I got to meet people from all walks of life, from all different settings and countries and backgrounds. And I got to learn and gather information from all these different contexts of what CGM access looked like in those different countries. And then basically united with an organization called TreeShake, and then Sweet Life being one of the biggest online diabetes platforms or communities in South Africa. And we did a push to get testimonials from people living with type 1 diabetes, basically to ask them to give a testimonial. What would life look like if you had access to something that could give you continuous feedback on your glucose levels versus finger pricking? So some people had already access because they were self-funding through cash. And we got these stories from parents, caregivers. We then realized how instrumental the clinical advocacy component is when it comes to advocacy. So here we had the lived experience testimonials. We then got written letters from clinical advocates, head of endocrinology units throughout the country. We started a petition. So we needed to create that demand and show that there was a need for it. I think that petition got around 14,000, 15,000 signatures. And together we put that all together. And we sent that off to one of the largest medical aid schemes or private funders in the South African context. And that really got our foot in the door to have those initial conversations around why we wanted this, why we needed to push. And, we had that whole history of like going from urine test strips to blood glucose test strips and now to this new technology. And what happened in that change between urine testing to blood glucose? Because there was very much a price point difference there, maybe not as much of a price point difference as we're talking between blood glucose testing and CGM. But we really wanted to also try and gather evidence around what those long-term impacts look like from a financial point of view, because when you're working with funders, you've also got to understand that it's a numbers game. You've got to speak business. So that is where, as SA Diabetes Advocacy, we really come from a collaborative point of view, because we understand that this has to work not only for the person living with diabetes, it needs to work for the funder, and we need to work with the manufacturers as well to have all of these conversations and to move things forward. So yeah, basically got our foot in the door, started having those conversations. Not going to lie, it took a long time. After 2 years of negotiating, one of the biggest funders came back and said, right, we'll give everyone 2 continuous glucose monitors a year. And I cried. I went to social media and I cried on social media because I was like, you do not get the point of continuous glucose monitoring if you think that 2 sensors a year per person is going to impact anything. And I honestly, I've never taken to social media to crying and putting on a show, but I honestly was so frustrated at that point after 2 years of negotiations for them to come back and say that. And anyway, went back to the drawing board, basically got everyone on the medical aid scheme to email the same person at the same time on the same day, so that you're not just one person amongst a million, but one person amongst everyone at the same time with the same subtitle of an email. Messaging you can't be ignored when everyone messages at the same time. And again, we got our foot in the door. And after another year of negotiating, they then started funding for all children under 18 for free, and on a tiered plan, depending on what the sort of plan you're on with the private funder, you pay co-payment. So some of the higher plans, you don't have to pay co-payment at all. And then as you go down, you start paying a cash co-payment alongside that. So we made some huge strides in terms of the private healthcare space. And again, what I love to tell people is that I had no idea what I was doing. I've never studied, you can't study diabetes advocacy or you kind of, it always reminds me of that one episode on Friends. I don't know if you've ever watched it, but where Ross is carrying the couch up the stairs and he keeps on shouting, pivot, pivot, because that's all you're really doing. You go down here and you read across crossroads and you meet someone who tells you maybe this avenue is better, maybe that avenue is better. But what I've always stood for is maybe this was never going to happen. It was a big, hairy, audacious goal that we had. And it just takes that 1% of hope. And my co-founder, Bridget McNulty, we're a little crazy like that. We always have this 1% hope that anything's possible. And I think that really drove us to just keep on keeping on. And once we made that stride, we realized, as I said before, that over 85% of people in South Africa are accessing their healthcare in the public sector. So what are we going to do there now? And you might have seen online, we're currently running a cgm-access-petition in the public healthcare sector. We're getting head of endocrinology units across all of our provinces to write letters of support. We are going to be at the Diabetes Alliance 2025 Diabetes Summit in November, and we're hoping to hand over, alongside the petition and letters of support, to our National Department of Health, because in previous conversations, it's been said that there's no demand for CGM in public healthcare. And my question back was, how are you supposed to know that you have access to something if you've never heard about it, or if it's never been given to you as an opportunity? How are you supposed to show that demand? So that's really been our avenue to go down to create this demand now, to show that there's the care. And again, Rome wasn't built in a day. This might take 10 years. But if I'm that person at the end of the 10 years that gets to see this become a reality, then I know that I've served my purpose here. 100%.
I mean, I'm just going to reflect back there some things that I took from that, and I think I've understood. But it'd be interesting maybe for you to see whether this sort of reflects it fairly. So, I mean, what you've described so far is you have a passion for this. You've got personal skin in the game in terms of diabetes affects you. You've seen how different it can be, and seeing that discrepancy between what you've got available or possible versus what more than 85% of the people don't, is just not okay with you. And therefore your drive is just kind of like, I'll just keep going. You keep telling me no, I just need to find another way. Just keep telling me no, I'll need to find another way. You take me no, I'll just find another way. And I really like how if people are listening to this from a playbook perspective, you've done some really smart things. And I had a podcast with Partha Carr, and his sort of approach mirrors, you've obviously talked to him, so there's probably some similarities, but it's kind of, okay, how do you get the people on board? Well, you already had a platform via Instagram and your space, but not only that, you made the petition, which is the key thing. You got 40,000 people to say, we want this, which is huge. That's huge. And then you obviously got the clinicians on board with letters of support, so it's coming from that aspect as well. So you kind of got the dual thing from there, from support. And then essentially, like you say, life is a negotiation. People are always going to come to you and lowball you. That is just the starting point. It's like, you do not accept that at any point. You go, that's interesting. In fact, you've set the ball there. I'm not even admitting that's an offer. That's not even an offer. That's not even on the table. We're not even starting there. Where we're starting is here, and maybe we can negotiate down from here. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the approach. It sounds like you're taking that from the private sphere, which, but people could quite easily look at that and say, oh, well, you just sorted out the people by private healthcare, kind of, why didn't you start with the public? Well, you don't start that way. You start with where you've got a chance, where you know that people from a private perspective, they have to look at long-term complications. They have to look at cost effectiveness, because they're the people in 10, 20, 30 years, they'll be paying out. So they're interested in that. It's a little bit similar in the NHS. Although the NHS is a public health scheme and the government runs 4 years to 4 years, they're generally not looking 20 years in advance, because the government that's in at that time isn't paying for it. But the private care for healthcare is. But now you've got a big battle on your hands in terms of getting the public health to really go, okay, we can't ignore this. And it sounds like you're on your way with the petition that's currently running, which obviously put a link to in the show notes. And in terms of signing that petition, who can sign that?
So yeah, basically anyone who has an interest in gaining perspectives in terms of, or gaining access globally, even from that perspective, but this specific petition that we're running, as you said, you've got to start small. If you go somewhere to a funder, whether it's private or public, you can't just say we want it for everyone. Of course, we want it for everyone, but as I said, you've got to understand that this is it's a moving part. There's many stakeholders and role players here, and it needs to work for everyone. So you have to be realistic. So what we've done is, specifically with this petition, is we've gone specifically for children under the age of 18 that are living with type 1 diabetes and accessing their healthcare in the public space in South Africa. So we've been very specific and targeting a very small portion. And we worked with endocrinologists to decipher what was the most important or the most crucial part to get in. We were thinking of going with a smaller subset, such as pregnant women living with diabetes, as we thought that might go faster because it might be a smaller subset of people. But essentially what we got down to was specifically children under the age of 18. And John, I think I'd like to also just introduce that Find Diagnostics are doing incredible global work at improving access to continuous glucose monitors in low and middle income countries. So they launched their project called Accede. I can't really remember the acronym, but basically trying to get access to continuous glucose monitoring into South Africa and Kenya. And I got to be part of really the really foundational parts of what that research would look like and how they would enter the market, and getting into the depths of, as these newer CGMs were coming into the market at a cheaper rate, it really came and dawned on me that these CGMs are not created equally. And I think through going through this whole process with Find and understanding CGM technology a bit better and what it means and what it doesn't mean, it's really drawn me down this path of not only CGM accuracy, but that CGM accuracy should not come at the cost or the safety of the person who is using the device at the end of the day. So as much as we are so open to alternatives in the market, because we know that drives innovation, we know that drives demand, we know that that's going to push down prices, we really don't want that to come at the cost of the person living with diabetes. And that's something that's really shone through over the last 2 years of our work with Find and really diving into what that looks like in a lower income setting.
I mean, you've just transitioned right into my territory now, CGM accuracy. I'm probably going to jump on my soapbox, so I apologize. But here we go. But before I do that, I think actually, I'll certainly put this in the show notes, but the thing that really struck me as you were just saying that is, okay, this petition that you've got from the public health perspective, people who are thinking about this from a worldwide perspective, who've got a view on, wow, really every person with diabetes, regardless of your skin color, your income, whatever, should be offered the opportunity. You could almost see South Africa as kind of like the pilot test case. You're already so far further along than most of the countries in that particular challenging financial perspective, that if you can make a serious dent in there with a big push from public support, whether it's people like me signing the petition because I'm interested because I want global access, whether it's someone from America, Denmark, wherever, you could go along and sign that petition, and your weight behind that could actually allow South Africa to really push that forward on a public health perspective, which then basically sets the precedent for any other advocate who wants to go, there is the model. That's the model. It's proven it can be done. There's actually a lot of people behind it. How do we take that model and we go and pop it somewhere else where you've got someone who's got skin in the game for that particular place to push it forward? So I would really encourage, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, can I be bothered going to the show notes and clicking a link onto the CGM petition and putting my name if I really believe in it? I almost implore you to just give 2 minutes of your time to go and sign that. I'll be certainly doing it after this. And I haven't done it before. It's just dawned to me there. It's just kind of the bigger the push from everyone, use this as a test case and you've got the opportunity to go out wider. So I just wanted to say that before I got on my hobby horse. Okay, we're into my realm now. So into the sort of CGM accuracy perspective. And I think it's really important what you just said is, I've been banging on about this for ages, but I'm in a country where it's very developed in terms of financially. We have CGM at point of care for all the people on the public health. And we're in a position where we're really pushing for global standardization to make sure that all the CGMs that are available for people for insulin dosing without finger pricks, and also for systems that are just insulin, should be standardized and should be proven to be high quality. And that fight is on. But that's potentially something a little bit different to getting access to CGM to a worldwide at an affordable price, but also in a safe way. So the reason why I say this is back in 2000 and maybe 10 or 12, CGM in the UK was not a thing. The Freestyle Libre came along, the first option, along with maybe the Dexcom G4, and there was like the NI as well. And all at that point, every single device was for what they call adjunctive therapy only, which means when it comes to insulin dosing, you need to do a finger prick. But they were revolutionary. They changed people's lives, and those were good systems, even though you couldn't do insulin dosing with them. And I think the big challenge now is that manufacturers that are coming to market are kind of caught between two things. They want to be cheap enough to gain access to the developing markets, but they're also trying to jump into developed markets with an indication for insulin dosing as well. And there's obviously a lack of data, and they're coming in with kind of trying to cover both angles, which has, I guess, unknown risks. I mean, I don't know whether some of these devices are accurate or not because we don't have data to support them, but I think it's important to really draw a line in the sand in terms of saying, look, if you want a cheaper, wider, more accessible CGM, and you want it to be half the price that it currently is for these systems that are for insulin dosing, then that's fine. But it comes along with the caveat that it still has to be good accuracy data. There still has to be potentially to do finger pricks alongside for insulin dosing. But if that's what it takes to get it at a cost affordable price to get things moving, then that's fine. It's just not fine to also have those devices to be masquerading as having clinical data and effectiveness for insulin dosing, which is a kind of a different thing. And I think I was speaking to one of your friends, colleagues at Find, and they were saying that you sort of part of funding a study where they looked at one of these devices that was available on the healthcare service. And when they did the actual proper accuracy study alongside the Freestyle Libre 2, it was found that the Freestyle Libre 2's accuracy data held perfectly, whereas the reported accuracy for this particular system, which had been previously tested on 90% of people with type 2 diabetes where the glucose doesn't move, as soon as they put it in a study test with people with type 1 diabetes, I don't really like MARD because I hate it, but just it makes it easy to say, it went from a MARD of about 9% up to 22%, which means it's just, that ain't good.
I think, John, if I can jump in here quickly, that's not being spoken about enough from the lived experience perspective. So it's happening a lot in the clinical setting, in the scientific space, this whole accuracy jargon and talk. But the layman living with diabetes, the general person on the street living with diabetes, when they go online and they see that there's a device available for purchase, they believe that this device is safe to use. They believe that this device has been safely tested and that when it's in their hands, they are going to be safe. And I think that's what really scared me about all of this talk, because initially that specific device that you just spoke about, that's MARD shots up to 22%, we outwardly spoke out about it to our community, and we were really slapped back from the manufacturer to say, you can't speak about us like this online. And I said, you know what, I've just taken evidence that was available online and put it all in one place. And it's really up to the people with the lived experience to speak to community about this, and to kind of, as I want to say, dumb it down, but to make it understandable so that people know their rights, so that people know, a little bit more around the educational components around CGM standards, and really making it relatable, if that makes sense. Because the last thing you want to do is make it complex, too scientific, too deep, because then people are going to immediately step away and not trust CGMs at all. And that's not what we want to do.
I'm smiling there because I asked you to give me some feedback on a post that I did. It's like, it's really good, but wow, it's like deep and complicated. Like it's all right for me because I've been immersed in this space, but like the average person who doesn't want to get as nerdy as that is going to have a real problem in kind of decoding what you're putting down there. How can you make it more simple? So you came up with 3 things which I thought were really powerful, just in kind of like simple one-liners that explain, at the moment, although we have a raft of CGMs available with what we call CE marking, which basically is a market indication in Europe that it can be used for people with diabetes, for example. But that isn't a quality standard, and it means that within all those products with CE marking, you've got some which have been tested robustly and some which we have no data for publicly available at all. And that then leads to kind of three things. And I think the first thing you said is, well, not all CGMs are created equally, meaning that they don't measure the same thing. Some aim at the level that you take your finger prick, which is capillary glucose, and they run close to that. And then there's some that run below venous glucose, that if you ever go to a lab and they take your HbA1c out of your vein, that's your venous glucose, and they're reading below that. And where that becomes really important is that means that if you're aiming for 70% time in range, which is between 3.9 and 10 millimoles per litre, or 70 to 180 milligrams per decilitre, the same person with two CGMs running at the same time, the same actual glucose level in the blood, you will end up with 70% on one device and 60% on another device. And the 60% is actually where you are and not the 70. And the reason why that's a big problem is if you come back to clinic, or even you're a person yourself, you're going to be like, I'm running at 70. I'm all good. I'm hitting the clinical targets. I am on point. And then all of a sudden you get to later on in life and you're like, hang on a minute. I've said that if I run at 70%, I wasn't going to get these problems. And I've got all these problems. What the heck is going on? And then if you found out that for the last 10 to 15 years, you were running 10% actually lower than you were, you'd be well pissed off. I'd be really pissed off with that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other way I think about it is, I was going to say, the other way I think about it is, I went to university and my tutor was telling me, you're smashing it. You're getting 70% on every assignment. You're up for a first class degree. And then it came down in 4 years' time and I got a lower second class because I was really running at 59%. You better believe I wouldn't be happy with that tutor. You better believe that. And that's kind of the risk of the future with CGMs, as all these different CGMs come to market. At the moment, we don't have a standard to let us know which ones run at proper 70% and which ones are actually over reporting to what really matters. And I think that has a serious problem moving forward, certainly for the people with diabetes wanting to know where their glucose levels actually are to understand their risk. The trust in CGM as well, in terms of from a person with diabetes. And it'd be such a shame that you work really hard in South Africa and you get this public funding and all of a sudden they go, okay, we've got these 3 devices and these ones are now will meet the cost pressures that we were talking about. We're going to go for this one. And it's one of these devices that over reports time in range. And then everyone goes on one and they get their clinical target of 65, 70% time in range, but the future complications actually don't mirror what the CGM is saying. And that is a real risk unless we kind of get this standard of testing CGM. So they're all aiming at the same place. So they're all reading the same glucose essentially close to your finger prick. Is that simple enough, or I've still done it too much on terms of the technical side?
Yeah, 100%. It's very much way simpler than the wonderful deep dive that you did. And I think it's so important that deep dive is available somewhere from a trusted source, because it is so interesting and it is so multifaceted, and there's so many moving parts to it. And the way that you dive into it in your blog post is really informative for those that do have a little bit more of a nerdier background that will understand all the complexities that you go into. But I think essentially the 3 key messages, as you said, are CGMs are not created equally. That's the first message that I would like to send home. The second one is the impact that CGMs that are not accurate right now in your life. So that's how this first came to life for me, is that a CGM entered the South African market. It had only been tested on 17 people with type 1 diabetes. And unfortunately, we had a lot of community complaints of children ending up at DKA events because the sensor couldn't accurately sense low glucose events. And that for me really wrote home, and why I started becoming passionate about this, because of the effect now. And it was only when I had this conversation with John about a week ago that I realized that this was actually an implication on the future as well. So I think those are the 3 key messages: that CGMs are not created equally, that an inaccurate CGM is going to have a big impact on someone right now in terms of hypoglycemic or hyperglycemic events. And then the third thing is that long-term complication risk of living with type 1 diabetes or any form of diabetes, actually. And that long-term complication risk if your CGM is not actually showing you accurate data over a lifespan of living with diabetes.
I mean, you just basically summarize what took me about 9 years to work out in 30 seconds. So well done for that. that's the beauty of your advocacy training. So we're at a position, we've got an issue where they're all not created equal. There is a risk, unless we know better, that both immediate lows and highs will go undetected and there'll be problems, which has already been shown by anecdotally in South Africa and certainly plenty of other places. I know in Italy they had a CGM device that won a tender for the national tender on very little data, and they had huge problems, and now that's been pulled. So it's already happening. And then something that I'm particularly concerned about is these ones that are reporting glucose that are below venous glucose levels, underreporting where the glucose level is, which artificially inflates your time in range, the long-term complications of that. So there definitely needs to be a standardization of testing and moving forward so that when funding becomes available and these newer devices, as long as they're effectively tested and they show they're measuring close to capillary glucose, then brilliant. Like, that's what we want. We want competition. We want competition to drive down prices. We want people to have great access. But what we don't want is, we don't want this access to open up and then people to be on systems that are not delivering what we know they could do, which would just be criminal to get to that point and then be missing. So I think that is a good point to kind of finish on as such, but to kind of really just put a bow and a bell and a hat on or whatever and just go, this is really important. It's happening in developed places where the funding's already there. It's going to be happening in developing places, especially where the price point is going to be pushed down and they're going to come in cheaper, that people need to be made aware of this. And I guess a couple of things that can really help people with that. So there's the defined set of questions that you should ask about a study before you even entertain its accuracy, which will tell you. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then there's also the work that I did with the Diabetes Specialist Nurse Forum, which is a simple sort of 5-question grid that if you don't get a score of 4 out of 5, you don't even ask about the accuracy. You just go, that's brilliant. It's great you've got this thing, but it doesn't relate to the people who I support or me because you didn't test any of those people. It's great, but you can need to do some data on the people who are going to use it. That would be a good idea. So we'll point to those two things in the show notes. What would you like to leave people with? So I've heard from you. You've got serious skin in the game. You're not going away. You keep on going until this is kind of gets to a point where, number one, CGM becomes available. You're really concerned and want to make sure that once that does happen, that the right devices are available, that are high quality enough at the right price, which is obviously a big battle. There are some tools at the moment that will help. Where do you see the next year or two of your personal journey going to kind of keep the fight going? What are the big things for you? And maybe what can people who are listening, if they're interested, can support your journey, which will in turn support a global journey of getting access to CGM?
The golden egg would be that we get ISO standards certified for continuous glucose monitors on a global basis. But in the interim, because that could take, I think, 5 to 10 years for that to actually happen, we really need to learn how to educate our communities. And that's going to look different in different local contexts. And I think that's what's important, because what John has available in the UK is very different to what is available in the South African context. We speak different languages, we have access to different things. So I think my takeaway or take home message here or ending point is just to say that we're really trying our best to pilot something here in South Africa by distributing these 6 key questions that John was talking about in a local context. And we're hoping that if we get to distribute it here from a South African context, we'll be able to pilot that, because as John was saying earlier, if something works here, it's bound to work somewhere else. And it's not about always reinventing the wheel. It's about taking things that have worked in another context and localizing it. And I think that's what we really want to do here. And that's what I see happening over the next year in a South African context, just really pushing, keeping on motivating, keeping on pivoting. And as you say, when you get told this is a dead end, turn around and walk another way. There's always someone else. There's always another conversation, another connection, a person, a direction. One of my favorite quotes ever is, there's no such thing as rejection, only redirection. And it's something that I keep with me close to my heart every single day, just to remind myself that it's not rejection, it's just redirection. And that's where I see myself going for the next year.
That just reminds me of going out on a night out at about 25. And there's no such thing as rejection, just redirection to the, the next opportunity. Oh, God. But yeah, it's just flashbacks. But, I think for me, if people are listening and they're thinking, wow, maybe I have taken for granted, I certainly did, the ability to have access to technologies very quickly. That's not the case worldwide. There's loads of people who could benefit from this technology. That isn't going to change overnight, but if South Africa, for example, was a test case where you're already along your way, you could sign that petition, you could lend your support, you could download the fine questions, you could download the DSN chart and kind of upskill yourself on simple questions to ask, and then pass that knowledge on. And then finally, if you really feel from what we've said that 70% time in range should mean 70% time in range regardless of the system that you need, you're going to use, then it's going to be important in the future to make sure we've got some sort of international standard or framework that means that when a CGM is tested and it takes that data to someone to get a regulatory approval, they follow a set of guidelines so that we as the users feel confident that 70% means 70%. And that's a long way away. But again, it ain't going to change overnight, but it's only going to change if people understand it's important and then get their own skin in the game and kind of, sort of push forward with that. So I want to say thank you. I want to drop in the show notes, the links to the petition, the links to the South African advocacy group, the fine stuff, all the bits and pieces will be kind of in the show notes. And then I'm sure they can find you. Where they're going to find you on Instagram? What's your handle? I'm no good on social media, by the way. I do not know what I'm doing. But so where people are going to find you on the socials?
Every day is Diabetes Day on Instagram, but I'm mostly live on LinkedIn. So you'll see me there as Kirsten de Klerk.
Okay, perfect. So we'll get people, I'll put those links in as well. So if people want to sort of check you out, first of all, go and say what an amazing job you're doing. Maybe they've got some ideas for you, which I always love the best is when people come back and go, I heard what you're doing, but you could do this something different. Like some people take offense that I'm like, keep it coming. Keep it coming. I'm loving that stuff. So I'm hoping that there may be someone across the world is like, we've already done that here. We've already done this. I can blend my support. That would be amazing if they reached out and went, oh yeah, here's a playbook. Here's our playbook. We can take some notes from it. So good. Well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to come and tell us your story. Amazing turnaround, and to really then push that forward to paying it forward to the rest of the people of South Africa, and who knows, maybe further and wider later on. And I'm sure they'll have to be around too at some point when you've got further on and you can tell us about what's happened and what's not. And yeah. So I just appreciate you and thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks so much.